My sister-in-law kicked me out saying, "You're nobody here." 1 minute later, someone walked in who she least wanted to see. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I stood in the corner of the living room, clutching my half-empty wine glass, feeling every word Catherine spoke pierce through me like sharp needles. 3 years. 3 years I had endured her barbs, her contemptuous glances, her ability to turn any family gathering into torture for me. The evening had started like all the others. David's family had gathered to celebrate his father's birthday, and I had arrived with my usual hopeful smile, thinking maybe tonight would be different. Maybe tonight Catherine would finally accept me as part of the family. How naive I had been. Catherine stood at the center of the room like a queen holding court, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the chandelier light. She wore a cream silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and she knew it. Everything about her screamed old money, breeding, entitlement. Everything I wasn't. David really should have consulted us before making such permanent decisions, she was saying to her Aunt Margaret, but her voice carried just loud enough for me to hear. Some people simply don't understand our family's standards. My husband sat on the leather sofa, scrolling through his phone, either oblivious to his sister's cruelty or choosing to ignore it. I had stopped expecting him to defend me months ago. David loved me. I knew that. But he also worshipped his sister. Catherine had practically raised him after their mother died when he was 12. In his eyes, she could do no wrong. "Elena looks tired," Catherine continued, finally turning her ice blue gaze directly on me. Marriage to a Whitmore must be exhausting for someone from her background. The room fell silent. Even Uncle Robert, who had been telling a loud story about his golf game, stopped mid-sentence. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my response. But what could I say? That I worked 60 hours a week to help pay for our mortgage while Catherine lived off her trust fund? That I had earned my MBA while she had dropped out of college to marry her first husband? I took a sip of wine, letting the bitter taste coat my tongue. "I'm fine, thank you." "Of course you are, dear." Catherine's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "You always manage to. Adapt." The word hung in the air like a slap. Adapt. As if I were some kind of invasive species that had somehow infiltrated their pristine ecosystem. David's father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should move to the dining room. Margaret has prepared a lovely meal." But Catherine wasn't finished with me yet. As the family began to shuffle toward the dining room, she stepped directly into my path, blocking my way. Her perfume was cloying, expensive, suffocating. "You know, Elena," she said quietly, but not so quietly that others couldn't hear. "I've been thinking about what you said last week about feeling like part of the family." My stomach dropped. I had confided in David about feeling excluded, and he had obviously shared it with his sister. Of course he had. "The thing is," Catherine continued, her voice growing louder with each word, "family is about more than just a marriage certificate. It's about breeding, class, understanding your place." The room had gone completely still. Even the grandfather clock had stopped ticking, or maybe my heart had stopped beating. I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, could see the pity and embarrassment in the relatives' faces. "Catherine." David finally spoke up, but his voice was weak, uncertain. "No, David," she snapped, whirling to face him. "Someone needs to say this. We've all been tiptoeing around it for 3 years." She turned back to me, and I saw something cold and final in her eyes. This wasn't just another casual humiliation. This was an execution. "You don't belong here, Elena. You never have, and you never will. You're trying so hard to be something you're not, but we all see through it. The cheap jewelry, the discount designer knockoffs, The way you pronounce certain words. You're not one of us." My vision began to blur at the edges. The wine glass trembled in my hand. Around the room, I could see David's relatives shifting uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one defended me. "You can put on all the airs you want," Catherine continued, her voice rising to a crescendo. "But you'll always be that little nobody from nowhere who somehow tricked my brother into marriage. So why don't you do us all a favor and stop pretending?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, could feel tears threatening to spill down my cheeks. David was staring at his hands, his face flushed with shame, but whether for me or his sister, I couldn't tell. Catherine took a step closer, so close I could see the triumph gleaming in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You are nobody here. Nobody. Get out of my house." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, my wine glass slipping from my nerveless fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. Red wine spread across the pristine white oak like blood. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to escape this humiliation, to never show my face in this house again. I could feel myself starting to turn toward the door when it happened. The front door opened. Catherine's face went white. Not pale, but actually white, as if every drop of blood had drained from her body in an instant. Her mouth fell open, and she made a sound like a wounded animal. Margaret Whitmore stepped into the room. David's grandmother. Catherine's mother-in-law from her first marriage. The woman who had been traveling in Europe for the past 2 years. The woman Catherine had told everyone was too frail to travel anymore. Margaret was 82 years old, but she moved with the grace and authority of someone half her age. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a simple black coat that probably cost more than my car. But it was her eyes that commanded attention. Sharp, intelligent, and currently fixed on Catherine with an expression of pure disdain. "Hello, Catherine," Margaret said pleasantly, as if she hadn't just witnessed her daughter-in-law's brutal attack on me. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Catherine's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Margaret, we thought you were... How did I get here?" Margaret finished. Elena called me. All eyes turned to me and I felt a flush of confusion. I hadn't called Margaret. I barely knew the woman. We had met only twice, both times at family funerals. Margaret walked further into the room, her cane tapping against the floor with each measured step. She surveyed the scattered wine and broken glass, then looked at Catherine's stricken face. "You seem surprised to see me, dear," Margaret continued, "though I suppose you would be. After all, you've been telling everyone I'm too senile to travel, haven't you? Too frail to leave my little cottage in Sussex?" I never..." Catherine stammered. "Oh, but you did." Margaret's voice was still pleasant, conversational even, but there was steel underneath. "You see, I've been in touch with Elena for months now. She's been writing to me, telling me all about how the family has been treating her, how you've been treating her." I stared at Margaret in shock. I had never written to her. I had never even spoken to her outside of pleasantries at those funerals. But something in her eyes told me to stay quiet, to let this play out. Catherine looked around the room desperately, seeking support from the other family members, but they were all staring at Margaret with a mixture of awe and terror. Margaret Whitmore was the family matriarch, the keeper of all secrets, the one person whose authority no one questioned. "Margaret," Catherine tried again, her voice shaking. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. I was just explaining to Elena about family expectations." "Were you?" Margaret raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "And what exactly did you tell her about family expectations?" Catherine's face was now shifting between white and green. She knew she was trapped, but she didn't know how deep the trap went. We were discussing. It's complicated, Margaret." "Oh, I'm sure it is." Margaret moved to the center of the room, claiming the space that Catherine had occupied just moments before. You know, Catherine, I've been thinking a lot about family expectations during my time away, about what it means to be a Whitmore, about honor and loyalty and treating others with dignity. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was so quiet I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock again. And I've been wondering, Margaret continued, how you reconcile those values with embezzling money from your late husband's estate? The words dropped like a bomb. Catherine stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. What? What are you talking about? She whispered. Oh, come now, Catherine. We're all family here. Margaret's smile was razor sharp. Surely you remember the trust fund Charles set up for David's education? The one you've been slowly draining for the past 5 years? David's head snapped up. What trust fund? Margaret turned to her grandson with gentle eyes. The fund your brother Charles established before he died, dear one. It was meant to pay for your graduate school, perhaps help you start a business. There should have been nearly $200,000 by now. I don't understand, David said, looking between his grandmother and his sister. Catherine said Charles never left any money for education. She said he spent everything on his medical treatments. Is that what she told you? Margaret's voice was full of sad disappointment. How interesting. Because I have the bank records right here in my purse. Would you like to see where that money actually went? Catherine made a desperate grab for Margaret's purse, but the old woman stepped back with surprising agility. Catherine! David was on his feet now, his face flushed with anger and confusion. What is she talking about? It's not. It's complicated, David. The money was for family expenses, for maintaining the house, for your gambling debts. Margaret finished calmly. For covering the money you lost in Atlantic City. For paying back what you borrowed from the country club fund before they pressed charges. Each revelation hit the room like another explosion. I watched the faces around me change from confusion to shock to disgust. Uncle Robert's mouth hung open. Aunt Margaret covered her face with her hands. You're lying, Catherine snarled, but there was no conviction in her voice. You're a sick old woman making up stories. Am I? Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. These are copies of bank statements, dear. Transaction records showing regular transfers from Charles's educational trust into your personal accounts. There's also a lovely correspondence between you and various casinos regarding your significant debts. Catherine's face crumpled. She looked around the room frantically, seeking an ally, an escape route, anything. But everyone was staring at her with expressions of horror and betrayal. David, she pleaded, reaching toward her brother. David, please, I can explain. I was going to pay it back. I just needed time. You stole from me, David said quietly, but his voice carried absolute fury. You stole my inheritance and then made me feel guilty for not being able to afford graduate school. You made me take out loans, work 2 jobs. I was protecting you, Catherine shrieked. I was trying to keep this family together. Do you think I wanted to use that money? Do you think I had a choice? You had a choice, Margaret said firmly. You could have asked for help. You could have been honest. Instead, you chose to steal, and then you chose to take out your shame and guilt on an innocent young woman who had done nothing wrong except marry into this family. Margaret turned to look at me directly for the first time since she had arrived. Her eyes were kind, full of an understanding that made tears finally spill down my cheeks. Elena, my dear, she said softly, I owe you an apology. I should have intervened sooner. I should have protected you from this woman's cruelty. But I never called you. I managed to whisper. I never wrote to you. Margaret smiled. No, you didn't. But David did. Every head in the room turned to my husband, who was now staring at his grandmother with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. David? I breathed. He stood up slowly, walked across the room to where I stood among the broken glass and spilled wine. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I've been writing to Grandmother for 6 months, he said, telling her how Catherine was treating you, how the family was treating you. I was too much of a coward to stand up to my sister, but I couldn't stand watching you suffer anymore. You called me last week, Margaret added, still looking at David. You told me about the things Catherine had been saying, about how she was planning to humiliate Elena tonight. You begged me to come home. I stared at my husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. He had been protecting me, fighting for me, even when I thought he had abandoned me. I flew back from London yesterday, Margaret continued. I wanted to see this behavior for myself. I wanted to give Catherine a chance to prove she wasn't the cruel, jealous woman my grandson described. She turned back to Catherine, who had collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands. Instead, I walk in to hear you call this lovely young woman nobody and order her out of your house. Not your house, Catherine. Charles's house, which you've been living in rent-free while stealing from your brother-in-law's trust fund. It's not fair, Catherine sobbed. I gave up everything for this family. I took care of David when Mother died. I managed the estate, I organized the gatherings, I kept us all together. You kept yourself in control, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. And you've been so afraid of losing that control that you've turned into exactly the kind of person this family has never tolerated. A bully and a thief. David reached for my hand and I let him take it. His fingers were warm, steady, real. Around us, his relatives were beginning to murmur among themselves, processing everything they had heard. What happens now? Uncle Robert asked quietly. Margaret considered this. Well, the money will need to be repaid, of course. I'll be speaking with the family attorneys tomorrow about the best way to handle that. As for Catherine, she looked at her daughter-in-law with something that might have been pity. Catherine, you have a choice. You can accept responsibility for what you've done, enter treatment for your gambling addiction, and begin making amends to your family. Or you can continue down this path of denial and cruelty, in which case you'll find yourself facing both civil and criminal charges. Catherine looked up with red-rimmed eyes. And if I get help? Then you'll always be family, Margaret said simply, but you'll no longer be in charge of it. The words hit Catherine like a final blow. For someone who had defined herself by her control over others, the loss of that power was perhaps worse than any financial consequence. I think, Margaret continued, that it's time for Catherine to go home and think very seriously about the person she wants to be. And I think it's time for the rest of us to remember what this family is supposed to stand for. She walked over to where David and I stood, still holding hands among the broken glass. Elena, my dear, she said warmly, I wonder if you might help an old woman find a place to sit down. I have so many stories to tell you about this family. Real stories, not the fairy tales Catherine has been spinning. I looked into Margaret's eyes and saw acceptance, warmth, belonging. Everything I had been desperate to find in this family. Everything Catherine had tried to convince me I could never have. I would love that, I said. As Margaret took my arm and we walked toward the sofa, I caught sight of Catherine struggling to her feet, her face a mask of defeat and rage. She looked around the room one last time, perhaps hoping for some sign of support, some indication that she might still salvage her position. But the family was already turning away from her, gravitating toward Margaret and me. The balance of power had shifted completely, and there was no going back. Elena, Catherine called out desperately as she headed toward the door. I turned to look at her. This woman who had made my life miserable for 3 years, who had tried to convince me I was nothing. This isn't over, she said, but her voice was hollow, defeated. Yes, I said quietly. It is. And as Catherine walked out the front door, I realized that for the first time since I had married into the Whitmore family, I was exactly where I belonged. Margaret squeezed my hand gently. Welcome home, dear, she whispered. The broken glass still glittered on the floor, the red wine still stained the white oak. But somehow the room felt cleaner, brighter, filled with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. I was no longer nobody. I was family.